The 9,625th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Denmark, Estonia, Germany, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It's so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Lisa Doughton, Director, Financing and Partnerships Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and Ms. Kathleen Howarth, Director for the Conflict Observatory Team, Yale Humanitarian Research Lab. It's so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Lisa Doughton. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Mr. President. When we last briefed the Council on April 11th, we informed you that Ukraine was enduring some of the worst attacks since the start of this war. Since then, attacks on Ukraine have only escalated further. Relentless hostilities continue in communities along the northeastern border with the Russian Federation and on the front line. Several waves of attacks in the Kharkiv region over the past few days have caused the death and injury of numerous civilians, including children. Just today, the city of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, was struck again, injuring at least 15 civilians. They have also led to the massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, a trend I'll come to in more detail in a moment. These attacks have triggered yet more displacement from border and frontline communities. As of today, authorities report that over 7,000 civilians were evacuated from border areas of the Kharkiv region, and they have had devastating consequences for civilians who remain in those areas, with many cut off from access to food, medical care, electricity, and gas. People in Donetsk and Sumy regions in the east and north of the country were also impacted by attacks in recent days, with homes and civilian infrastructure damaged. In total, the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, recorded more than 700 civilian casualties across Ukraine in April. 129 civilians were killed, while 574 were injured, a significant increase in the number of civilians injured for the second month in a row. 90% of all civilian casualties occurred in Ukrainian-controlled territory. Strikes have also been reported inside the Russian Federation, including on Sunday in the Belgorod region, reportedly also resulting in several civilian casualties and damage to residential homes and other civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, across Ukraine, we have also seen an intensified pattern of attacks on civilian infrastructure with far-reaching humanitarian consequences. Since March 22nd of this year, the UN and its partners have seen 5 waves of attacks directed against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. OHCHR recorded 50 such incidents in April alone. Kharkiv and Dnipro regions are particularly affected, with Ukraine's energy ministry reporting up to 250,000 residents experiencing rolling power outages in Kharkiv and ongoing restrictions in Dnipro since March. These attacks have destroyed or damaged power generation plants and electricity substations. The impact of these power cuts on the most vulnerable is stark. They have temporarily left millions of households across the country with no power, no water, and no gas needed for cooking, heating, hygiene, and other vital services. Children who rely on online schooling are not able to learn. Older persons with mobility impairments, persons with disabilities who use wheelchairs or other assisted devices, and mothers with small children are unable to leave multi-story apartment buildings to access food and medical support. Mr. President, we're extremely worried by what appears to be a new pattern of attacks on railway infrastructure in the east and south of Ukraine. In April alone, OHCHR recorded 10 attacks on railway infrastructure in government-controlled territory. The attacks killed 16 civilians and injured 59 more. Damage to the railway system also prevents the movement of people, goods such as construction material, and other essential supplies. Also concerning are the attacks on factories and production plants, limiting the availability of locally procured humanitarian goods. In addition, continuing attacks on Ukraine's port infrastructure threaten their ability to export grain and other agricultural commodities at a time when the number of people facing acute food insecurity around the world continues to rise year after year. And we're alarmed by reports of attacks damaging energy infrastructure and oil refineries in the Russian Federation. Such attacks risk inflaming the war further and worsening its humanitarian impacts. I'm compelled once again to recall that under international humanitarian law, the parties must take constant care to spare all civilians, as well as civilian objects, including homes, schools, hospitals, and other essential infrastructure. Mr. President, the intensification in hostilities is making the delivery of humanitarian assistance all the more dangerous. Nevertheless, the UN and its humanitarian partners are doing everything we can to reach people in need of support, despite the enormous risks. Across the country, as of the end of March this year, 3.6 million people have received some form of humanitarian assistance. So far this year, a dozen interagency convoys delivered vital supplies to 20,000 people in frontline areas. Local humanitarian partners have been instrumental in conducting last-mile delivery and distribution. Assistance has also included the delivery of healthcare services to nearly 860,000 people, maintenance support for water and wastewater systems for more than 1.7 million people, and emergency water supplies for more than 1.2 million people. 2 million people have received food, seed, and livestock support, while around 580,000 people have been helped with essential household supplies and materials for emergency home repairs. Humanitarian protection activities have been expanded, including gender-based violence support for people newly displaced by the hostilities. We commend the government of Ukraine for the additional support it has announced for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in the form of financial reparations and medical and psychological assistance. We're also incredibly grateful to donors who have so far provided 22% of the $3.1 billion needed for the Ukraine humanitarian needs and response plan. We call on donors to provide immediate and flexible financial support, which is so urgently needed to respond to the ever-growing needs. Mr. President, another challenge remains reaching civilians in the areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia that are currently under the occupation of the Russian Federation. We're deeply concerned about the estimated 1.5 million people in need of life-saving assistance in these areas. As we said in last month's briefing and repeatedly in this council, in accordance with international humanitarian law, all parties must allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. They must ensure that humanitarian personnel have the freedom of movement required for their work. I renew my call to the parties to comply with the obligations in this regard. Mr. President, this war has caused the death and injury of tens of thousands of people in Ukraine. It has displaced millions, many of whom continue to seek refuge in neighboring countries and across the world. It has caused immense suffering and left more than 14 million people, or 40% of the population, in need of humanitarian assistance. We once again call on this council to seek an end to it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Doughton for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Kathleen Howarth.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to brief the Council on the bombardment of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The Council's focus on this matter comes as waves of attacks sweep across Ukraine, targeting power generation and transmission facilities nationwide. A week ago, missile strikes caused serious damage to 3 thermal plants and 2 hydroelectric power plants. A few days ago, another large-scale infrastructure attack was reported. By some counts, nearly every single power plant has been targeted. On 29 February of this year, Yale Humanitarian Research Lab released a report documenting verified damage to Ukraine's power generation and transmission infrastructure that took place between 1 October of 2022 and 30 April 2023, a period of just 31 weeks. Through a combination of open-source data and satellite imagery analysis, HRL identified 223 damage events across 23 of Ukraine's 24 oblasts, and we verified 66 of those events to our rigorous high-confidence standards across 17 oblasts. That's a rate of over 7 damage events identified per week, with peak impact timed for the height of winter. Just last Wednesday, almost a dozen Ukrainian power facilities were reportedly struck in a single day, from 7 averaged a week to nearly a dozen in a day. Since March of 2024, successful targeting of power generation facilities has further slashed Ukraine's capacity. Each hit compounds the problem. Russia's officials have clearly stated their objectives for targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. First, to advance Russia's military objectives. Second, as retaliation for Ukraine's purported actions. And third, as the intentional infliction of harm upon civilians to compel Ukraine to submit to negotiations favorable to Russia's interests. While the first justification may be lawful within the bounds of the laws of war, retaliation and intentional infliction of harm likely violate international humanitarian law. Yale HRL did not assess the degree of dual use afforded by the energy infrastructure documented in our report. However, the law of armed conflict prohibits attacks on both civilian objects and military targets if the attack causes excessive civilian casualties or damage to civilian objects, or a combination, relative to any concrete or direct military advantage anticipated. As State Duma member Andrei Guryulov defined Russia's campaign, it is aimed against Ukraine's whole energy systems. A comprehensive campaign, by its own definition, defies proportionality. Russia's officials used language that indicates a disregard for the extent of civilian suffering in apparent contravention of Additional Protocol 1, particularly Article 57's obligation for parties to take constant care to spare the civilian population, civilians, and civilian objects. Beyond expressing a disregard for civilian suffering, officials have stated that they are utilizing that suffering to compel Ukraine to negotiate on terms favorable to Russia. As Dmitry Medvedev wrote in October 2022, in order for Ukraine to stabilize its energy supply, it must, quote, recognize Russia's legitimate demands in the context of the special military operation and its results. Then the lights will work again. Or as Boris Chernyshov said when he called strikes on Ukraine's power infrastructure strikes of retribution for purported and unspecified war crimes. For that, they will sit there without gas and without electricity and without everything. What does it mean to go without gas and without electricity and without everything? It means that too much pressure is put on other parts of Ukraine's critical infrastructure, causing cascading problems and further damage. It means extended periods without water. It means jobs are ground to a halt, productivity is lost, and education is fragmented. It means blackouts last longer than the emergency batteries on life-saving healthcare equipment. The impact of these strikes cannot be assessed only by logging damage to facilities. It will take far more to understand the scope and scale of the harm done to Ukraine's civilians, including lives lost. As Ukraine's officials have comprehensively planned and executed their destruction of Ukraine's critical infrastructure, so should the international community systematically counteract this devastation. First, target the missiles. Sanctions already in place must be enforced to ensure that weapons components and the resupply of other critical elements are stopped at the borders of countries that already recognize these sanctions regimes. We must track these components and target Russia's missiles at their source. Second, prepare for this emergency. Mobilize resources today to support and stabilize Ukraine's economy and ensure that emergency humanitarian aid is in motion now to ensure civilian survival this winter. Third, let Russia pay. Release Russian assets seized under global sanctions to fund these emergency preparations over the next 6 months, work that cannot begin soon enough. Above all else, do not underestimate the scale of this threat. Russia's wholesale destruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure targets the heart of its civilian population. If it is allowed to bleed from 1,000 cuts, hope will drain away. But every action that makes this heart stronger makes all of Ukraine more capable of defending itself. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Haworth for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France. You have the floor.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
je remercie Mesdames Dalton et Haworth pour leurs interventions.
For their statements.
Depuis maintenant plus de 800
For more than
jours,
800 days
la
now,
Russie
the Russian
persiste
Federation
dans
has
sa
been
guerre
persisting
d'agression contre
in
l'Ukraine
its war of aggression
en
against
violation
Ukraine
du droit international et
in
de la
violation
Charte
of
des Nations
international
Unies.
law and the
Elle
United
poursuit ces
Nations
violations du
Charter.
droit
Russia
international
has been
humanitaire
pursuing its
et
violations
elle
of
mène
international
des
humanitarian
campagnes de
law
frappe
and has been
délibérées
waging a
contre des
campaign of
objectifs
deliberate strikes
civils.
targeting
Elle
civilian
exécute ces
objects.
stratégies
Russia has been
au
carrying
prix d'un
this
lourd
strategy
bilan
out at the
humain
cost of a
et
heavy
d'une
human
dégradation
toll
inquiétante de la
and
situation humanitaire.
the alarming
Nous venons de
deterioration of the
l'entendre,
humanitarian situation. We
l'armée
have just
russe
heard
cible
that the Russian army has been
systématiquement
systematically
les unités de production
targeting
énergétique
Ukrainian
ukrainiennes,
energy production
centrales thermiques,
units, including
centrales
thermal power
hydroélectriques,
plants, hydroelectric power plants,
sous-stations et
substations, and
transformateurs.
transformers.
Commencé à l'hiver
This
2022-2023,
campaign
cette
began in
campagne
the
s'est
winter of
intensifiée
2022 to
depuis
2023.
février
It has
2024 et a culminé
intensified
avec des
since
salves
February
de grande
2024
ampleur
and has
fin mars
culminated
et début avril.
with large-scale
50%
salvos in late
des
March
capacités
and
de
early
production
April.
énergétique
50%
ukrainiennes
of
seraient détruites ou
Ukrainian
endommagées.
energy
La
production
Russie a frappé
capacities have been
Kharkiv et Odessa
destroyed or
de manière
damaged.
presque
Russia's
quotidienne
been
avec
striking
des missiles
at
balistiques. Ces frappes en
Kharkiv and
profondeur,
Odessa
loin
on
des
an
lignes de
almost daily
front,
basis
ne
with
répondent
ballistic
pas à
missiles.
des objectifs
These are
militaires.
strikes
Mais elles visent des
targeting
infrastructures civiles. Ces
the
attaques
depth of the territory of
contraires
Ukraine, far from
au
the front
principe
lines.
de
They are not in
distinction
any
et de
way geared towards
proportionnalité.
achievement
Elles
of any
montrent que la
military
Russie ne fait
objectives.
aucun
They are
cas
targeting
de
civilian
l'obligation de
infrastructure, which is
minimiser
critical for
les blessures aux
populations.
civils
This runs
et
counter
les
to the
dommages aux
core
biens de
principles
caractère
of
civil.
IHL
Ces
for the
frappes
protection of
peuvent être
civilians,
constitutives de crimes de
distinction
guerre
and
et crimes contre
proportionality. This
l'humanité.
reflects the fact that
La
Russia
France
has no
poursuivra
concern when it
son
comes to
engagement
possible
pour faire face aux
precautions being
conséquences
taken
humanitaires des
to
attaques de la
mitigate
Russie. Monsieur le Président,
this
il ne doit pas y
wounds
avoir d'impunité
inflicted upon
pour ces
civilians and
crimes.
damage to
La
civilian
France
objects.
continuera d'apporter son
France
soutien à
will
la justice
continue to
internationale.
deliver support for
Les mandats
international
d'arrêt
justice.
émis le
The
5
arrest
mars
warrants
2024 par la Cour pénale
issued on 5
internationale
March
contre Sergei
2024 by the
Ivanovich
ICC against
lieutenant
Sergei
général de
Ivanovich
l'armée de l'air russe, et
Kobilach,
Victor
Lieutenant
Nikolaevich
General
Sokolov,
of the Russian Aerospace
vice-amiral
Forces,
et commandant
and
de la
Victor
flotte russe
Nikolaevich
de la mer
Sokolov,
Noire,
Vice Admiral
portant
of the Russian Black
précisément sur la
and
campagne
Russian Black
de
Sea
frappe de
Fleet
missiles contre des
Commander,
infrastructures
related to the
énergétiques
campaign
civiles,
of
sont une
missile
étape
strikes against
décisive. La France
Ukrainian
salue
civilian
le
energy
renouvellement du mandat de la
infrastructure
Commission
are a
d'enquête
decisive step
indépendante
forward.
du Conseil des
France
droits de
also
l'homme
applauds the
qui
renewal of the mandate
documente
of the Commission of
les attaques
Independent Commission of
indiscriminées
Inquiry
contre
of
les
the Human Rights
populations
Council, which
et
has
les
been
infrastructures essentielles de
documenting
l'Ukraine.
indiscriminate
Monsieur
attacks
le
against
Président,
populations
pendant que la
and
Russie mène des
critical
attaques
infrastructure in
destructrices
Ukraine.
pour le
President,
secteur
while Russia has
énergétique
been
ukrainien,
carrying out
l'Ukraine
devastating
et le reste
attacks
du monde
targeting
agissent pour
Ukrainian
atténuer
energy
les
infrastructure,
conséquences
Ukraine and the
humanitaires de
rest of
cette
the world
guerre
has been
et soutenir
acting to mitigate the humanitarian consequences of this war, to provide support to the populations by stepping up the resilience of strategic infrastructure. This is an issue which will be subject to discussions during the conference for peace organized by Switzerland next month. Their only way towards a fair and lasting peace is the path that is respectful of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador. You have the floor.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President.
Doy las gracias a la señora
I
Doughton
thank
y a la señora
Ms.
Howard por
Doughton
sus
and Ms.
detalladas
Howarth for their
exposiciones
detailed
informativas.
briefings.
El Ecuador observa con preocupación
Ecuador has
cómo el
noted with
conflicto en Ucrania
concern
se
that the
profundiza
conflict
y
in
extiende,
Ukraine is worsening and
exacerbando el
spreading,
sufrimiento de la población
exacerbating
civil
the suffering of the
y
civilian
creando riesgos
population
adicionales que
and
pueden
creating
afectar la
additional
estabilidad
risks which may
regional y global.
affect regional and global
Las
stability.
estadísticas son
The
alarmantes.
statistics are alarming.
Más de 10.000 civiles
More
han
than
perdido la
10,000
vida desde el
civilians have
comienzo del
lost their
conflicto,
lives since the beginning of the
incluyendo
conflict,
centenares de
including
niños.
hundreds of
Más de
children.
20.000
More
personas
than
han resultado
20,000
heridas
people have been
y
wounded
millones han sido
and millions
desplazados.
have been displaced.
Desde la última ocasión
Since the last time
este consejo debatió
this
sobre
council
la situación humanitaria en
discussed the
Ucrania,
humanitarian
la
situation in
escalada de la
Ukraine,
intensidad
the
y
intensity
frecuencia de los
and
ataques
frequency of
ha
attacks
continuado.
has continued to
Infraestructura
escalate.
esencial, que incluye hospitales y escuelas,
Essential infrastructure, which
ha sido
includes
destruida o
hospitals and
gravemente dañada.
schools, have been
Solamente
destroyed
este
or
mes
seriously damaged.
hemos visto
This
ataques
month
que han
alone, we have
inhabilitado
seen
varias
attacks
instalaciones
which have
energéticas,
disabled a number of
afectando el
energy
acceso de millones de
installations,
personas
affecting
a servicios
access of millions
básicos
of people
como la
to
electricidad
basic
y el agua
services
potable.
such as electricity
Días
and
pasados,
drinking
en la
water.
región de
In
Kharkiv,
recent days, in the Kharkiv
el
region,
impacto de los
the
ataques ha
impact
sido
of
igualmente
the
devastador,
attacks has
con
been
numerosas
equally
víctimas
devastating,
civiles y un aumento
with many
significativo
civilian
de los
victims and a
desplazamientos
significant
internos.
increase in IDPs.
Es imperativo recordar
We must
que el derecho
recall
internacional
that
humanitario es explícito
international
en su prohibición
humanitarian
de
law is
ataques contra
explicit
civiles
in
e
prohibiting
infraestructura civil.
attacks against
En ese
civilians and
sentido,
civilian
el
infrastructure.
Ecuador hace un llamado a
That
las
being said,
partes a
Ecuador
adherirse
appeals to the
estrictamente a
parties
los
to adhere
principios de
strictly to the
proporcionalidad,
principles of
distinción y
proportionality,
precaución
distinction, and
para evitar
precaution
la
to
escalada de este
avoid
ciclo
an
de
escalation
sufrimiento.
of this cycle of
Es
suffering.
fundamental que se permita y facilite el paso seguro y sin
Safe and
obstáculos
unfettered
de la
delivery
ayuda
of
humanitaria
humanitarian
y
aid
que se
must
respete y
be
proteja la
allowed and
vida y la seguridad de
facilitated,
los
and the
trabajadores
life and safety of
humanitarios.
humanitarian workers
Señor
must be
Presidente,
respected and protected.
Excelencias,
Mr. President,
colegas,
Excellencies,
el
colleagues,
Ecuador mantiene una posición
Ecuador
clara y de
maintains a
principio
clear
frente a este y otros
positioned
conflictos.
principle on this and
Está
other
en contra de
conflicts.
cualquier violación de la
We
soberanía e integridad
reject
territorial de
any
los estados
violation of
y
sovereignty and
apoya la
territorial
resolución
integrity of
pacífica de las
states, and we
controversias.
support the peaceful settlement of
La manera más
disputes.
efectiva de
The
poner
most
fin a la
effective way
devastación que
to put an
enfrentan los
end to the
civiles en el cese
devastation
es el cese definitivo de
suffered
las
by
hostilidades.
civilians is a definitive
Mientras no se silencien las
cessation of
armas, el
hostilities.
sufrimiento de los
Until the
inocentes
weapons
seguirá
are
aumentando,
silenced, the suffering of
independientemente de los
innocents will
esfuerzos
continue to
humanitarios y de
rise
las medidas de
regardless of
protección
humanitarian
implementadas.
efforts or
Para
protection
esto,
measures
el
that
Ecuador
have been
insta a la Federación
implemented,
Rusa
and therefore
a poner fin a
Ecuador
sus
urges the
operaciones
Russian
militares en
Federation to
Ucrania
put an end to its
y a
military
cumplir con lo
operations in
dictaminado por la
Ukraine
Corte
and to
Internacional de
comply with
Justicia
the
el 16
ruling
de
of the
marzo del
ICJ from the
2022
16th of March
para dar paso al diálogo y a la
2022
diplomacia
and to make room
con
for
vías
dialogue
legítimas
and
y efectivas para
diplomacy,
la búsqueda de la paz.
the legitimate
Muchas
and
gracias.
effective ways for promoting peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Lisa Doughton for the comprehensive update and note the contribution of Ms. Caitlin Howard. I also welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Germany, Estonia, Poland, Denmark, and the European Union in today's meeting. Mr. President, despite the many calls by this Council for full compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law, and for the parties to the conflict to comply with the legal requirement to protect civilian objects, they continue to be destroyed almost daily. Guyana is deeply alarmed by the unrelenting attacks on residential buildings, schools, medical facilities, grain ports, and energy facilities since the start of this war in February 2022. We are also concerned that these attacks were often unrelated to frontline engagement and appear to have little regard for the requirements of proportionality and military necessity. International humanitarian law is clear in its prohibition of attacks targeting civilians and objects indispensable to the survival of civilians. Yet, we continue to witness large-scale coordinated attacks on civilian infrastructure, including dozens of energy facilities, resulting in disrupted access to electricity and water supply for millions of people in multiple locations. The damage, destruction, or loss of functionality of energy facilities are having direct and reverberating effects on civilians. They are not only causing incidental civilian harm through the disruption of access to critical services, but are also resulting in loss of civilian life and injury to those living in nearby target sites, near to target sites. There have also been attacks on the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant ZNPP in Ukraine. Despite the many calls for an end to attacks on or near the site, the IAEA team of experts stationed at the site continues to report hearing military activities, including artillery and rocket fire in areas near the plant. This cannot and must not continue. Greater care must be taken to eliminate the persistent dangers posed to the safety of the ZNPP and to adhering to the 5 concrete principles and 7 indispensable pillars for ensuring nuclear safety at the site. Guyana reiterates its call for the parties to respect and adhere to international humanitarian law. We also urge them to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict and call for the withdrawal of Russian military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. We maintain that prolonging this war poses increasingly grave risks for all concerned and for international peace and security. We further call for scaled-up humanitarian support to Ukraine and for humanitarian workers to be granted unhindered access to all areas, including the occupied territories. In closing, Mr. President, Guyana once again encourages the continued engagement of the international community to end this war as soon as possible. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Doughton and Ms. Howard for their valuable briefings. It is regrettable that we heard again today in a briefing from the UN about the many civilian casualties caused by the clear violation of the UN Charter by a permanent member of the Security Council. Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine has resulted in the deaths and injuries of countless innocents, exacerbated the humanitarian crisis on the ground. Energy-related facilities throughout Ukraine are under continuous attack. On May 8th, President Zelensky said that Kiev, Zaporizhia, and other regions have been attacked with more than 50 missiles and 20 drones. The energy minister of Ukraine said that about 80% of thermal power plants have been damaged. We also note that OCHA reports intensified attacks in the Kharkiv region are causing civilian casualties, widespread destruction, and displacement from frontline and border areas. Japan is deeply distressed by Russia's continuous disregard for international law, including international humanitarian law, IHL. Attacks against civilians and critical civilian infrastructure are clearly prohibited by IHL. The international community will not tolerate impunity for those responsible and perpetrators of violations of IHL, and all heinous acts must be identified and held accountable. In addition, Japan condemns in the strongest possible terms North Korea's export and Russia's procurement of ballistic missiles, as well as Russia's use of these missiles against Ukraine. The transfer of those weapons, which is a clear violation of the relevant Security Council resolutions, supports Russia's war of aggression and increases the suffering of the Ukrainian people. We continue to monitor closely what North Korea gains in return. Mr. President, needless to say, a stable energy supply is foundation to people's lives. To this end, Japan has supported the recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. This includes provisions of 2 large auto transformers, benefiting around 500,000 residents in Kiev, and the delivery of 6 mobile power supply vehicles to the Ukrainian Seaports Authority. Additionally, Japan has supplied 5 advanced gas turbines and transported 7 auto transformers to help prevent energy shortages and maintain critical services for the over 5 million people during the challenging winter months. Japan remains committed to supporting the Ukrainian people through bolstering the electricity and heating supplies in Ukraine. Mr. President, once again, we reiterate our clear position to urge Russia to stop the aggression and immediately and unconditionally withdraw from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Japan continues to stand with the people of Ukraine and the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria. You have it.
سيد الرئيس، بداية أود أن أشكر ليزا داوتن على إحاطتها القيمة. ولقد استمعت كذلك بعناية للإفادة التي قدمتها السيدة كيتلين هاورد. سيد الرئيس، عبرت الجزائر في العديد من الاجتماعات عن عميق قلقها إزاء تدهور الحالة الإنسانية الناجمة عن الأزمة في أوكرانيا وإزاء منطق المواجهة الذي لا يزال يملي تعامل الأطراف مع الوضع والذي ينقل بتداعياته المأساوية على السكان المدنيين مع ما يترتب من عواقب على الصعيدين الإقليمي والعالمي ولا تزال الخسائر في أرواح المدنيين
the loss of civilian life, the suffering of refugees and IDPs, the destruction of the civilian infrastructure, including energy power plants, are a source of great concern to us. In addition to that, there is worsening in tensions, the pursuit of hostilities, and an exacerbation of this polarized situation, which has dangerous repercussions in the international arena, without mentioning the economic fallout and impact and the social impact in particular in the energy sector. We therefore reiterate our appeal for diplomatic efforts to be pursued in order to avoid a further humanitarian crisis and to address the humanitarian suffering without any distinction. Cessation of hostilities is needed. Civilians must be protected, and the UN Charter and international law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected. Algeria calls on all parties to set aside this mindset of confrontation and to find what is needed in order to restore comprehensive dialogue and constructive dialogue on the basis of the principles of the peaceful settlement of disputes, and we urge the parties to direct their efforts to find a just and lasting solution to the crisis in Ukraine, basing themselves on the goals and purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the legitimate concerns of both parties. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom. You have the floor, Matt.
Thank you, President. And I thank Director Lisa Doughton and Director Caitlin Howarth for their informative briefings. This spring, Russia has targeted power plants, electricity substations, and gas storage facilities across Ukraine. The United Kingdom calls for an immediate halt to this destructive campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Millions of people already face disruption to power, heating, and water supply. These attacks are making an appalling humanitarian situation worse. This is especially the case for frontline communities, as the attacks and lack of power hamper humanitarian partners' communications and movements. The most recent attack on the 8th of May involved over 70 missiles and drones. Since March, at least 14 power stations have been hit. Iranian-made UAVs remain Russia's weapons of choice in these attacks against civilians and their infrastructure. Colleagues, Russia has targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022, and before that. In 2015, thousands of consumers experienced power outages when Russia hacked Ukrainian energy grids. Now, this pattern of Russian aggression continues in an attempt to terrorize civilians, obstruct livelihoods and businesses, and ultimately to break down Ukraine's resolve. But Ukrainians will not allow Russia to do that. The UK has committed $55 million to the energy community's Ukraine Energy Support Fund and over $214 million in overall support to the energy sector in Ukraine. We encourage donors to support this fund, to consider rapid provision of new or refurbished energy equipment, and to help provide air defense systems to protect Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. Together, we will help Ukraine repair, restore, and defend its energy infrastructure. One country could end this wanton destruction and suffering immediately. The United Kingdom calls on Russia to cease its attacks and withdraw from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their floor. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, OCHA Director Doughton, for your sobering briefing. I'd also like to thank Ms. Howarth for her well-researched presentation today. Mr. President, it has been over a month since our last meeting on the devastating humanitarian toll of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, including the country's energy and critical infrastructure. Civilians continue to bear the brunt. Reports continue of Russian forces committing torture, sexual violence, and the forced transfers and deportations of civilians, including children. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission verified that at least 604 civilians were killed or injured in Ukraine in March alone, a 20% increase from February. At least 57 of them were children. Millions of people have been left without electricity because of Russia's coordinated attacks on Ukraine's grid infrastructure, power generation, and natural gas infrastructure. These large-scale attacks striking Ukraine's cities and infrastructure are a clear escalation. They threaten critical services, including electricity, water treatment, and heating. Power plants in Kharkiv are operating at 20% capacity due to nearly daily attacks, forcing the evacuation of tens of thousands of civilians. Mr. President, next week, this Council will be subjected to yet another meeting where Russia will claim that Western arms are to blame for prolonging the war it started. Russia only need look in the mirror to understand why more than 50 countries have provided critical support for Ukraine's forces. Last month, the United States announced a $1 billion in new assistance to Ukraine. This assistance includes urgently needed capabilities like air defense equipment to defend Ukraine's citizens from Russia's relentless attacks. Since February 2022, the United States has also provided nearly $2.9 billion in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and neighboring countries. This includes life-saving support for the 3.4 million people who remain internally displaced and nearly 6.5 million refugees. Newly approved supplemental funding will help maintain the humanitarian response amidst unabated attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. The recent increase in Russian attacks reinforces the need for urgent humanitarian support to reach the 14.6 million people in need of assistance. We urge donors to support the humanitarian response through the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund or other partners. Mr. President, it bears repeating that Russia continues to deny international monitors and humanitarian organizations access to Ukrainian territory it occupies, as well as to facilities in Russia holding POWs and Ukrainian civilians. It bears repeating that Russia continues to procure ballistic missiles and other munitions from the DPRK in violation of Security Council resolutions. Fearing the mounting body of evidence against it, the Kremlin vetoed the mandate renewal for the DPRK panel of experts. It bears repeating that Russia continues to acquire Iranian UAVs, which are being used relentlessly against Ukraine's cities and civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, after over 3 years, the toll of Russia's aggression against Ukraine is well documented and researched. No amount of lies and diversions can cover up the sheer body of evidence. There will be accountability. But in the meantime, the way to end this war and the humanitarian crisis it has caused is clear. Russia must cease its aggression and immediately and fully withdraw from all territory within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, in what is now becoming a tradition, our Western colleagues once a month gather us here, all of us here to hold meetings on Ukraine, the sole purpose of which is to demonstrate the steadfast support of the collective West for the Zelensky regime, which is on the cusp of complete collapse. These meetings are now becoming sessions of collective self-hypnosis, which are intended first and foremost for the domestic Western audience. And at the same time, not a single utterance of truth about what is happening in Ukraine, nor about the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis, will you hear from Western colleagues. The Kiev regime sponsors, including those who are queuing up, namely non-members of the Security Council, EU countries, instead of this are engaging in trotting out tall tales, terrifying tall tales about the situation in Ukraine, and are attempting to create the impression about the intolerable suffering of civilians as a result of the actions of the Russian Federation. It is difficult to do this, rather difficult for them to do this, insofar as the Russian aerospace force strikes against facilities which are related to the military capabilities of the Kiev regime, are high precision in nature. The lives of Ukrainian cities are proceeding normally on the whole, if we are not to take into account the rounding up of Ukrainian men who the Ukrainian dictator is throwing into the front as cannon fodder against their will. This is an issue which we will return to later. We do not pity our Western colleagues insofar as these allegations appear odd, given the numerous video rolls with the destruction of alleged civilian objects in Ukraine. I refer to elevators, post offices, stores, and so on. These are images which clearly show the form of the detonation of munitions and fuel. It is sufficiently difficult to also explain why, after the strikes on alleged peaceful hotels and areas of relaxation on the internet, there are hundreds of obituaries of Ukrainian military personnel which appear. And at the same time, Western capitals continue to demonstrate a selective blindness when it comes to the crimes perpetrated by the UAF, insofar as they run counter to the mendacious portrayal of the world which they're trying to impose on their societies. In this picture in Ukraine, there are no violations of human rights and thousands of political prisoners. There is no Russophobia, no nationalism, no glorification of and whitewashing of the henchmen of Hitler, who claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians during the war, denying the sole argument. They use the single argument to deny all of this, and that argument being that the president of Ukraine is a Jew. Mr. President, if our Western colleagues were striving to convey to the international community at least an iota of the truth about what is happening in Ukraine, then they would not sweep under the rug, but rather they would condemn the latest craven terrorist attack perpetrated the day before yesterday by the Kiev regime. For it is perfectly well known that on 12th of May, the peaceful Russian city of Belgorod once again was targeted by a large-scale missile strike. For this purpose, 3 types of missiles were used: a tactical Tochka-U missiles, the Olch, MLRS, as well as the Czech-made Vampire systems. At 11:40 in the morning, as a result of the 5th attack during that day, one of the entrances of a residential building was destroyed. The missile was launched from the area of Volchansk, that is from the territory under Ukrainian control. 15 peaceful civilians died, 17 people received injuries at varying levels, including the victims included an infant, a month and a half old infant. Unfortunately, the shelling of Belgorod continued throughout the entire day, and the rescue operations had to be suspended several times even. On Sunday, another 3 people died. And this is just one instance of how those encountering the advancement of the Russian troops throughout the entire front and those experiencing more and more setbacks on the battlefield, I refer to Ukrainian nationalists, in their impotent rage, they are striving to shift their rage to target peaceful Russian cities, targeting them with strikes in a violation of the norms of international humanitarian law. Of course, for all of these crimes, first and foremost, the Zelensky regime is responsible. However, the culpability of Western countries at the same time is equal, insofar as the sponsors of the Kiev junta continue to provide it with long-range weapons, providing it with intelligence, and sending their instructors and mercenaries to Ukraine in the illusory hope of inflicting a strategic defeat upon the Russian Federation and seeking to attempt to weaken our country. We will have an opportunity to discuss these destructive actions of NATO countries in detail during a 20 meeting, which will be convened at our initiatives. For this reason, we will not dwell on that right now. I will merely state that having abandoned hope of achieving the results, having lost hope in their protégés, the sponsors of the Kiev regime have now begun to explicitly and overtly provide permission or grant permission to target peaceful objects with the weapons that they have been providing. For example, in early May, the British Foreign Minister, James Cameron, made a revelatory statement that the weapons provided by London can be used to carry out strikes against Russian territory, including in areas beyond the special military operations confines. The Latvian Foreign Ministry also confirmed that Ukraine received weapons from partners with permission to strike against Russian territory. And at the same time, in Western capitals are shamelessly avoiding discussion of the openly used terrorist ISIL-like methods which are used by their protégés, organizing attacks against journalists and activists on Russian territory. In March, this went so far as to include a major terrorist attack which was ordered targeting Crocus City Hall in Moscow. And if we are to add to this the long-standing disregard, disregard of repressions against dissenters and those against the Kiev regime, for example, the death in the torture chambers of the Ukrainian security forces of a U.S. journalist, Gonzalo Lira, it is hardly surprising that the citizens of Western countries are putting more and more questions to their authorities, and they are denying these authorities of their support. For with their indulgence and collusion in the crimes of the Zelensky regime, they are trampling upon those very values which they portray as the core pillars of the democratic world. Present-day Ukraine no longer seeks to conceal its decaying anti-democratic neo-Nazi essence. For example, in April, Kiev informed the Council of Europe about restrictions of the constitutional rights and freedoms of Ukrainians. In other words, the Zelensky regime took a decision thereby to formalize the long-standing practice of oppressing its own citizens. Information about staggering levels of violations of human rights in Ukraine is so difficult to sweep under the rug that even reports published in late April from the U.S. State Department points to numerous instances of torture, persecution against the church, arbitrary arrests, politically motivated killings. Letting off steam in this way, Washington, London, and Brussels, based on their customary practices, pin all the blame on Russia, at the same time forgetting that the persecution of dissenters and violations of human rights began in Ukraine long before the special military operations, at the very minimum, immediately following the anti-constitutional coup in Maidan 10 years ago. Distinguished colleagues, today the residents of Ukraine are encountering a qualitatively new level of violations of their rights. In just a few days, on the 18th of May, Ukrainian men of enlistment age will effectively become disenfranchised. With the entry into force of a new law on mobilization, they will find themselves outside the law. They will lose control of their property, monetary funds. They will no longer be able to renew or receive documents. And nonetheless, conscription evasion in Ukraine has reached staggering levels. This is exceedingly inconvenient for Zelensky and his sponsors, insofar as, according to their view of the world, the Ukrainians should readily march forth to defend their country. In fact, only in Romania, as became well known, 11,000 men of enlistment age fled. 19 people died in this attempt. In order to flee the country, potential enlistees abandoned their vehicles at the border. They don the garb of women and they carry out all sorts of clever tricks in order to deceive the border guards, their border guards. And at the same time, the danger of entering the front is something which only the poor and disenfranchised face. The wealthy, of course, have opportunities to bribe their way out. And when it comes to the children of those holding power, that story is completely different. They have long been spending the funds stolen by their parents, including Western assistance abroad. Colleagues, this is what is of concern to Ukrainians, not the lofty words of Western sponsors who are only interested in Ukrainians fighting on the front. On Ukrainian social networks, where the repressive machine of Zelensky has not yet reached, there are increasingly vociferous, seditious issues being raised. What are Ukrainians fighting for, and for whom? The arrogant, tainted by corruption Kiev henchman and his clique who trampled upon their own constitution and are losing even their formal legitimacy on the 21st of May? Are they fighting for their Western geopolitical interests to weaken Russia? Ordinary Ukrainians are increasingly beginning to clearly understand that their interest in this war, which the U.S. and satellites prepared the country for at least since 2014, that they have no interest whatsoever here. Especially given that when they receive news about the lives in the territories liberated from the Kiev regime, where former Ukrainian citizens finally are able to exercise their right to speak in their native tongue in Russian. To conclude, I wish to turn to our colleagues from developing countries. Consider all of these trends, the sincerity of which you can easily see when next time you are called upon to support certain formulae or plans advanced by the Ukrainian henchman and his Western sponsors. They are so divorced from reality that any meetings during which the discussion of this is proposed to be held will become a pure loss of time. In the worst of cases, you will become complicit in prolonging the agony of the Kiev regime, and the cost of this will be tens, if not hundreds of thousands of the lives of ordinary Ukrainians who are being thrown into this pointless meat grinder, contrary to their will, contrary to the interest of their country. It is possible to stop this merely by sending away Zelensky and his clique and the entire Maidan authorities to put them where they deserve, namely the dustbin of history. And this is what we are seeking to achieve right now. Thank you.
I thank the Russian representative for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Director Dalton for her briefing and Ms. Howard for her contribution. Mr. President, let me make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. One, As the resident coordinator, Denise Brown, stated recently, there are no peaceful mornings in Ukraine. Since the last time we met on this file in early April, more than 1,000 drone and missile attacks were recorded across Ukraine. Cities like Kharkiv and Odessa were hit especially hard. Thousands of people have again been forced to flee as their homes are being destroyed, finding themselves in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. Aerial pounding of critical civilian infrastructure is continuing unabated, as reportedly 140 educational facilities were damaged or destroyed in attack across the country in 2024 alone. In parallel, UNICEF has reported that the rate at which children are dying has increased by nearly 40% in the first quarter of 2024 in comparison to the same period of last year. 2. Russia's use of cluster munitions. According to the latest reports, Russia has used cluster munitions in its bombardment of Odessa in late April. Using such weapons in a densely populated area is against all rules of international humanitarian law. In one instance, submunitions were reportedly scattered across a 1.5 km radius, which will pose a threat to civilian population for years to come. Slovenia, as a state party to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, condemns the use of these indiscriminate weapons in the strongest possible term. 3. Attacks against critical energy infrastructure. In the last month, millions of Ukrainians lost power as the result of Russian barrage of Ukrainian energy infrastructure. The country's energy sector was hit especially hard last week when 3 thermal power stations were damaged. The intensity of the recent attacks against critical energy infrastructure outpaces the one from winter of 2022-23. Let me recall the arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court against 2 Russian commanders who are alleged to be responsible for war crimes of directing attacks at civilian objects and inhumane acts, including the campaign of strikes against energy infrastructure carried out in that period. These attacks seek to impair Ukraine's economy and are obviously not directed against military targets. This is a clear violation of international humanitarian law, and it needs to stop now. Mr. President, Ukrainian civilians have suffered too long. They and the wider region need a tangible prospect for peace. We call on Russia to stop with its subversive actions and give peace a chance. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this briefing. I also thank Ms. Lisa Dotson for her briefing. We acknowledge the contribution of Ms. Caitlin Howarth. I welcome the presence and participation of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Mr. President, 2 years since the start of the conflict in Ukraine have resulted in civilian deaths, widespread damage and destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and vital civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, leading to a dire humanitarian crisis. We are deeply concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which is being particularly exacerbated by attacks on critical energy infrastructure. Reports from Ukraine as recent as on 8 May suggest significant strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The attack reportedly caused significant damage to 3 thermal power plants, 4 hydroelectric power plants, 17 major high-voltage substations, and a gas storage facility in the Lviv region. Reports also suggest that the attacks have severely hampered Ukraine's energy capacity. More than 800 district heating facilities were destroyed or damaged, and up to 8 gigawatts of power generation was lost. 412 settlements remain offline, and hourly outages continue for household and industrial consumers in the Kharkiv and Kryvyi Rih Dnipropetrovsk regions. Overall, it is estimated that 50% of Ukraine's pre-conflict energy generating facilities are offline, and an estimated $1 billion will be needed for their restoration. We are concerned that attacks on the energy infrastructure have resulted in major disruptions in supply of essential services such as electricity, water, and gas to medical facilities, manufacturing industries, and places of work for a significant portion of the population. The impact on the provision of essential services slows down production levels and reduces economic activity. We are also alarmed by the impact on healthcare facilities, including those with incubators and other life-saving devices, which in some cases had to resort to the use of batteries that ran out before the establishment of power, putting the lives of many at risk. Mr. President, given the devastating impact of the conflict in Ukraine and parts of the Russian Federation on the civilian population, we call on the parties involved in the conflict to adhere to their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, including energy facilities in the circumstances. In acknowledging the efforts of the international community to address the humanitarian consequences of the conflict, we stress the urgent need for more coordinated international efforts to address the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. The 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan for Ukraine must be fully supported to ensure the well-being and protection of civilians affected by the conflict. Let me close, Mr. President, by urging all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, including energy generating and gas facilities, to prevent further harm and ensure the restoration of essential services for the well-being and stability of civilians. We reiterate our call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of hostilities and the parties to the conflict to engage constructively in good faith towards finding a political and diplomatic solution, recognizing the legitimate concerns. We also reiterate our call for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you. I would like to thank Director Doughton and Ms. Howard for their briefings. As we have heard, the death and destruction toll are getting heavier by the day. At least 10,800 civilians have been killed, including 600 children, and more than 20,000 civilians have been injured. Also, according to the Ukraine Humanitarian Needs Response Plan, 14.6 million people are estimated to be in need of assistance across Ukraine. Malta remains seriously concerned by the lack of humanitarian access, and we urge Russia to allow and facilitate a safe, timely, and unimpeded access in line with its obligation under international humanitarian law. Russia's indiscriminate attacks further exacerbate the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine, with over 14 million people in need of assistance. We must also not forget that the humanitarian consequences of Russia's war go beyond Ukraine. Russia has weaponized food and undermined global food security by terminating the Black Sea Grain Initiative, as well as shelling Ukraine's grain storage and export facilities. Malta will continue to support the EU's solidarity lanes, as well as all efforts aimed to address the humanitarian consequences of Russia's aggression. President, not a single week passes without airstrikes destroying the lives of thousands of Ukrainians. we once again condemn, in the strongest possible terms, the ongoing Russian aerial assaults on cities and critical infrastructure across Ukraine. Just last week, Russia carried out one of the biggest aerial assaults against Ukrainian power generation and transmission facilities in several regions. This deadly trend encompasses daily drone, missile, rocket, and artillery attacks in Kharkov, Odessa, Kherson, Donetsk, regions. These attacks are yet another example of Russia's disregard for human life, since they have disrupted vital services such as electricity, heating, water, gas, and other essential services for hundreds of thousands of civilians. As of today, more than 800 heat supply facilities have been destroyed or damaged, and the attacks have caused more than $1 billion worth of damage to the energy sector. Malta expresses its concern about the humanitarian consequences that this may cause, given reports that the latest energy disruptions will last for several months due to the extent of the widespread damage. Continuous attacks on schools and medical facilities are also having far-reaching consequences, making access to essential healthcare and education even more challenging and impacting the basic rights to health and education. According to the World Health Organization, solely in the first trimester of 2024, there have been more than 70 attacks on healthcare providers, supplies, facilities, warehouses, and transport in Ukraine. This is unacceptable. The impact of the war is also linked to mental health risks and trauma amongst millions of Ukrainians. Children have endured the loss of family members, their homes, and schools. These scars may last a lifetime. Furthermore, risk of gender-based violence have heightened, while the most vulnerable, often women, boys, girls, and older people, face the greatest challenges. President, for more than 2 years now, we have witnessed an unprecedented suffering and loss for Ukraine and her people. Russia's war of aggression is an affront to the principles to which the UN was built and constitutes a violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Russia's attacks continue to blatantly violate international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The Russian Federation must be held to account for the damage caused by the senseless war and for all other serious crimes committed. We express our full support to the mandate of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine under the auspices of the Human Rights Council, as well as to the important work undertaken by the Register of Damage caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. In closing, Mr. President, Malta reiterates that the only way to achieve a just and lasting peace would be for Russia to unconditionally and completely withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Je voudrais aussi remercier
I would also
la
like to thank
d'OCHA, Madame Doughton,
the Director of OCHA, Ms. Doughton, and Ms. Caitlin Howard, Director of the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab's Conflict Observatory Team, for their briefings. We welcome that voices of science are being brought to address this Council. In the meantime, in Ukraine, facts confirm the continuation of massive attacks on the civilian population and infrastructure. Switzerland condemns all these attacks which have killed and injured civilians in populated areas. Last week alone, several children were injured and schools and a hospital were damaged.
Alors que l'Ukraine se bat pour son avenir, toutes et tous ceux qui peuvent le construire, à commencer par les enfants, doivent être protégés. La population civile et les infrastructures civiles ne doivent jamais être des cibles. Nous appelons une fois de plus à respecter strictement le droit international humanitaire et à protéger la population et les infrastructures civiles. Nous avons observé une augmentation des attaques contre les infrastructures énergétiques critiques. Au total, 9 régions à travers l'Ukraine,
9 regions across Ukraine, including those far from the front lines, have experienced disruptions to their electricity supply last week.
La situation autour de la
The
centrale nucléaire
situation
de
around the
Zaporizhzhia
Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remains worrying. The 5 principles established by the IAEA for the prevention of an accident at this nuclear power plant must be respected in all circumstances. All aspects of life are affected by ongoing attacks. Millions of homes have been left without electricity, heating, or water supplies due to power cuts.
L'évolution inquiétante de la
The worrying
situation dans
developments
l'oblast
in
de
Kharkiv
Kharkiv
Oblast
démontre notamment l'impact
demonstrate the
humanitaire
humanitarian
de
impact of the
l'intensification des
intensified
hostilités.
hostilities.
Imaginez un instant ce que
Imagine for
signifie
a
mener
moment
votre
what
vie
it means
quotidienne
to
en
live your
Ukraine à
daily
l'heure
life in
actuelle.
Ukraine today.
Les travailleuses et travailleurs qui se rendent au
Workers
travail
who
en
travel
train
to work by
mettent leur vie en
train
danger
are
à
putting
cause
their
des
lives at
attaques
risk
contre
because
les
of
installations
attacks on
ferroviaires,
railway
comme cela s'est
installations,
produit
as has
notamment
happened
à
in
Dnipropetrovsk,
Dnipropetrovsk,
Kharkiv,
Kharkiv, Donetsk, and Cherkasy.
Les étudiantes et étudiants qui dépendent de
Students who
l'apprentissage en
rely
ligne sont
on
privés d'accès à
e-learning are
l'éducation en
denied
raison des
access to
coupures
education
d'électricité.
due to power
Et le
cuts,
personnel
and
humanitaire voit sa
humanitarian
sécurité
personnel risk
menacée
their safety
lorsqu'ils apportent de l'aide
as they
indispensable
deliver
dans des
essential aid
conditions déjà
under difficult
difficiles. En
conditions.
vertu du droit international
Under
humanitaire,
international
les
humanitarian
acteurs et
law,
actrices humanitaires ne doivent
humanitarian
jamais
actors
être
must never
attaqués
be
et
attacked,
leur mission
and their
doit
mission
être respectée
must be
et protégée.
respected and protected.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr.
la Suisse
President,
réitère que la
Switzerland
Russie doit
reiterates
mettre
that
fin
Russia
à son
must put an
agression
end to its
militaire
military
contre
aggression
l'Ukraine.
against Ukraine.
Nous restons
We
déterminés à
remain
faire tout ce qui est en
determined to
notre
do everything
pouvoir
in our
pour
power
contribuer à une
to
paix juste et
contribute to
durable
a
en
just
Ukraine,
and lasting peace in
conformément à la
Ukraine,
Charte des
in
Nations
accordance
Unies.
with the UN Charter.
C'est dans cet esprit
It
que la
is in
Suisse
this spirit
organisera
that
le sommet de haut
Switzerland
niveau
will
pour la
host
paix en
the
Ukraine
first
les
high-level
15 et
summit for peace in
16 juin
Ukraine
prochains.
on June
Nous sommes
15th and
conscients que le
16th.
chemin vers un
We are
véritable
aware that the
processus
road
de
to a
paix sera
genuine
long.
peace process will
La
be a
Suisse est
long one.
toutefois convaincue que la mise en
However,
place d'une
Switzerland is
plateforme
convinced
pour
that
des
setting up
discussions
a
de haut
platform
niveau
for high-level
représente un pas en
discussions
avant
represents an
important.
important step
Nous
forward.
espérons pouvoir compter
We
sur
hope
une
to be able to
participation
count on
de
the
toutes les régions du
participation from
monde
all regions
afin
of the
de créer
world
une
to
compréhension
create
commune
a common
de ce que
understanding
nécessite un
of what a
possible processus de
possible
paix
peace process
et définir
requires and to
ensemble une
define
feuille de
together
route sur
a
la manière
roadmap on
d'impliquer
how
les
to
deux parties
involve
dans
both
un futur
sides
processus de
in a
paix.
future
Je
peace
vous remercie.
process. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Ms. Doughton and Ms. Howard for their timely and insightful briefings. It is deeply regrettable that Russia has escalated its unjustifiable attacks against Ukraine in recent months and further expanded the front into Ukraine's northeastern borders near Kharkiv over the last week, despite the international community's condemnations. As Russia's full-scale invasion has persisted for more than 2 years, we are witnessing an erosion of our common principles intended to save people from the scourge of war. The brutalities of the war in Ukraine are not only demonstrated by more than 10,000 civilian casualties, but also by the impacts of the war reverberating into global food security, regional nuclear safety, and massive destruction of infrastructure. In recent months, in addition to attacking hospitals and schools, Russia has also been targeting the energy infrastructure across Ukraine, including thermal and hydroelectric power plants and gas storage, as Ms. Doughton eloquently described today. According to recent media report, 80% of the thermoelectric power plants in Ukraine were damaged, and Ukraine's power generation has decreased by 30% as a result of Russia's attacks. This tactic apparently aims to cripple Ukraine's basic functions and demoralize the Ukrainian people's ability to fight against the aggressor. Such actions are unacceptable, as targeting civilian infrastructure is in violation of international humanitarian law, as articulated in the first protocol additional to the Geneva Conventions, particularly when they are indispensable to the survival of civilian population. Today, critical energy infrastructure holds far more significance in people's daily lives than decades ago, when international humanitarian laws were created and developed. Therefore, they deserve particular protection by warring parties. In addition to hindering access to electricity for millions of Ukrainians in the short term, the destruction of energy infrastructure has long-enduring impacts on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Indeed, the recent ICRC report highlights domino effects, where the destruction of energy infrastructure leads to the disruption of other basic services such as the delivery of water and sanitation. And the lack of safe water, sanitation, and electricity can all impair the requisite operation of hospitals and the viability of food production and distribution, leading to the spread of disease, death, and displacement, disproportionately affecting children and women. Needless to say, drastic increase in humanitarian needs caused by the collapse of the critical energy infrastructure will make effective and coordinated humanitarian operations on the ground even more challenging. Lack of access to essential services will make both recovery and reconstruction there even harder in the long term. Mr. President, as repeatedly emphasized in the previous meetings, my delegation once again stresses that all the devastating events and human suffering transpiring in Ukraine are a result of Russia's illegal invasion. This must end now to save lives and restore humanity. The Republic of Korea will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine and provide vital assistance in the areas of security, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction until they achieve just and lasting peace as well as sustainable prosperity in their land. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China. You have the floor.
President, I'd like to thank the two briefers for their briefings. As the Ukraine crisis grinds on, recently there has been some escalation of ground clashes, and horrific attacks occur from time to time, resulting in huge casualties and grave humanitarian impact. China is deeply concerned about this. In view of the prolonged fight in Ukraine and the increasingly dire humanitarian situation there, China has repeatedly called on the parties to the conflict to remain rational and exercise restraint, strictly abide by international humanitarian law, and refrain from attacking civilians or civilian infrastructure. The longer the Ukraine crisis lasts, the more risks and challenges it will bring, and the more damage it will do to Europe and the world at large. Expeditiously realizing ceasefire, restoring peace, defusing crisis, and building a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security framework is the common aspiration of the international community. China is neither the creator of the Ukraine crisis nor a party to it. We have all along been campaigning for peace and worked to promote talks and have played a constructive role in pushing for peaceful settlement to the crisis. At the outset of the fighting, President Xi Jinping spoke with the leaders of Russia and Ukraine on the phone, calling on the two sides to stop fighting as soon as possible and resolve the differences through diplomacy and negotiations and settle their disputes peacefully. Later on the basis of in-depth discussion with all parties and fully heeding their views, China has proposed the four should principle to politically resolve the Ukraine crisis, namely the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously. All efforts conducive to resolving the crisis peacefully should be supported. During his recent visits to France, Serbia, and Hungary, President Xi Jinping had in-depth exchange of views with European leaders on the Ukraine crisis. He pointed out that China and Europe should work together to oppose the spillover and escalation of the fighting, create conditions for peace talks, and to safeguard international energy and food security and the stability of global industry supply chain. During President Xi's visit to France, China and France also agreed to seize the Paris Olympics as an opportunity to advocate worldwide ceasefire during the Games. Over the past 2+ years, the Special Representative of the Chinese government for Eurasian Affairs has engaged with representatives of the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and relevant European countries on political settlement of the Ukraine crisis, conducted in-depth discussions with all parties, and conveyed messages promoting cessation of hostilities. Recently, the Special Representative had just completed his third round of shuttle diplomacy in Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, among others. In all these diplomatic efforts and meetings and talks, China's message is consistent. China's proposal is also consistent. To sum it up, it is a message of 8 words, namely advocating peace, promoting talks, finding a political settlement. President, history has repeatedly proven that at the end of the day, conflicts can only be resolved through negotiations, and that military means cannot bring lasting peace. The Ukraine crisis is no exception. China calls on parties to the conflict to promptly resume dialogue and engagement and jointly lower the tension, and calls on the international community to create conditions for early cessation of hostilities. China will continue our objective and impartial position, maintain communication with all parties concerned, and make unremitting efforts towards a political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Mozambique. I thank Ms. Lisa Doughton and Ms. Kathleen Howard for their insights. I also welcome the representative of Denmark, Estonia, Germany, Poland, and Ukraine, as well as the representative of the European Union in this meeting. Distinguished Council members, the war in Ukraine has resulted in a severe refugee crisis, numerous casualties, widespread infrastructure damage, forced displacement of civilians, and long-lasting impacts. International efforts are crucial to alleviate suffering and address this humanitarian catastrophe. This conflict poses serious threat to regional and international peace and security. We remain profoundly concerned over the situation. Regrettably, the prospect for a mutually accepted solution remain elusive, since the conflicting parts firmly believe in a military logic and zero-sum game logic at the expense of cooperative approach. The repeated and consistent calls from the international community, including this Council, for the immediate cessation of hostilities can no longer be ignored. Dear colleagues, according to OSHA, by the end of 2024, nearly 300 million people around the world will need humanitarian assistance and protection, requiring almost $46.4 billion. Conflicts are the primary driver of this fragile global humanitarian landscape. The humanitarian tragedy in Ukraine adds immense pressure to this dire global context. As we reflect on this grim reality, we must consider promoting peace, dialogue, and understanding through diplomacy, aid, or grassroots effort. Every step towards conflict resolution matters. In this regard, we would like to reiterate once again our 4 points position. Firstly, civilians bear the brunt of this conflict. Their protection is paramount under international humanitarian law. All parties must ensure their safety and uphold relevant Security Council resolutions. Secondly, the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality must be scrupulously adhered and upheld by all parties. Thirdly, all parties must facilitate full, safe, rapid, and unhindered access for humanitarian personnel and relief to civilians in need. And lastly, ending this conflict is the sole way to address its humanitarian consequence. Against this backdrop, Mozambique advocates for a political and negotiated solution as the only path to lasting and sustainable peace between the two countries. We reiterate our call for the immediate cessation of hostilities and the return to direct negotiation without preconditions. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, I would have also recognized here the envoy of dictator Putin if he had not covertly extracted himself from the Soviet permanent seat, leaving behind the residual junior team. He has certainly failed to hypnotize not only the European members of the Council, but also its African, Asian, and Latin American responsible members. My sympathy, however, goes to the UN interpreters. I thank Ms. Dufton and Ms. Howarth for their briefings. On May 10th, the Russian army launched a new offensive targeting the northern Kharkiv region from Russian territory. The immediate aim is Vovchansk, which, along with nearby settlements, faces relentless artillery shelling, airstrikes, and the use of guided aerial bombs. The Ukrainian forces so far hold the line to prevent Russian troops from advancing to Kharkiv, the second largest Ukrainian city, and one of the main targets of fierce Russian missile attacks and airstrikes over the past months. Heavy defensive battles are underway in the border area in the north of Kharkiv region. The situation remains extremely dangerous for the local civilians. As reported by OCHA Ukraine, Russian attacks in Kharkiv region over the past few days have led to civilian deaths and injuries, including among children. These casualties contribute to the overall number of 1,993 children killed or injured since Russia started its invasion. This number, as UNICEF stated yesterday, the UN has been able to confirm, but the actual number is yet to be verified. The Ukrainian authorities swiftly initiated evacuations of civilians from the areas targeted by Russian attacks to safer locations. Nearly 6,000 residents have been evacuated since the assaults began, with the operation ongoing. Russian forces persist in razing Ukrainian towns to the ground without regard for the local population's suffering, with Vovchansk becoming the latest victim, akin to Bakhmut or Marinka. And the above is carried out by the country that installed itself in the Soviet seat as a permanent member of the Security Council, a seat that carries special responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. In fact, the Kremlin does not even care about the safety of their own population. The destruction of a multi-story residential building in Belgorod on Sunday is another example of Putin's disregard towards Russia's own citizens. It goes without saying that Russia will not allow independent international experts on the site. Instead, we have heard immediate propaganda allegations against Ukraine. It speaks volumes, however, that the local authorities and the Russian Ministry of Defense have issued different versions. As Putin's envoy decided to stick to the version of the Russian Ministry of Defense, I would like to remind him of his own cynical statement, and I quote, "While Ukrainian anti-air missiles misfiring or straying off course hit residential buildings and civilian objects, harm is also being caused by debris falling in residential areas solely because Ukrainian air defense systems are located here." He can quote this statement to his new Minister of Defense now, referring to the version by the Ministry of Defense of Russia. However, what experts draw attention to is the similarity of the destruction to the consequences of a guided aerial bomb explosion. Recently, reports of unauthorized drops of such aerial bombs from Russian aircraft over the territory of the Belgorod region have become routine. Several incidents have already occurred in May. For example, on May the 4th, a Russian aircraft dropped a 500-kilo bomb on Belgorod, damaging 30 private houses. On May the 12th, a similar bomb fell on the territory of Razumne 54 village in the Belgorod region. According to reports by Russian online sources, there have been 33 such incidents with unauthorized drops in Russian border areas and occupied Ukrainian areas since March this year. Given these numbers, it was just a matter of time before such destruction happened in Belgorod on Sunday. Mr. President, further deliberate aggravation by Russia serves a further proof of how far we remain from our goal of never again. The main motto of the anniversary of the victory over Nazism that the world marked last week. Atrocities of the war, again the reality for Ukrainians. On May the 8th, they woke up to air sirens and explosions. That day, 55 missiles and 21 drones attacked energy and other critical infrastructure in 7 Ukrainian regions, from west to east. The next day, Ukraine again sustained new Russian attacks against its energy generation facilities. Since the end of February, Russia has carried out 388 strikes on 131 energy infrastructure facilities, hydro and thermal power plants, dams and transmission systems. These strikes destroyed almost all of Ukraine's thermal power generation. On the 27th of April alone, 4 thermal power plants were damaged. On May the 8th, 2 more hydroelectric power plants were attacked by Russia and are no longer in operation. And all this is done by a country that called itself a friend of the UN Charter. Mr. President, the world defeated Nazis 79 years ago, but their modern reincarnation continues to kill, to destroy, and to threaten. Like Hitler, Putin used to salami slice neighboring countries. Having tested the world's reaction, he came to a similar conclusion to the one Hitler arrived at prior to September 1939, and he moved ahead full scale in February 2022. It speaks volumes that the so-called list of unfriendly states elaborated by Moscow coincides to a great extent with the list of the anti-Hitler coalition. Those who defeated Nazism are enemies for modern Russia, and now Moscow threatens these states with nuclear saber-rattling and makes them subjects for obnoxious verbal attacks. In contrast to 1939, Europe today is actually cognizant of the threat posed by Russia. Now Ukraine is the only country in the world being attacked by ballistic and cruise missiles almost daily. In April alone, Russian forces launched over 300 missiles, almost 300 Shaheds, and more than 3,200 guided aerial bombs. On May the 1st, missile strikes hit Odessa and Zolochiv, Kharkiv region, claiming 2 lives and injuring 19, while causing damage to civilian infrastructure. Further attacks on May the 3rd and Orthodox Easter, May the 5th, in Kharkiv, left more casualties, with a total of 380 shelling incidents recorded in the first week of May alone. Today, the Russian forces targeted a multi-story residential building in the heart of Kharkiv, resulting in injuries to at least 16 individuals, including 3 children. And don't forget that all this is being done by a country that declared itself the main fighter against Nazism at the United Nations. Mr. President, the situation in the temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories for the local population remains alarming. The Russian occupation army is full of convicted murderers, and the practice of recruitment of Russian prisoners in exchange for pardon persists. Some cases are shocking even for Russians loyal to Putin's regime. For instance, recently, the Russian media found in the Russian army 2 infamous murderers, a cannibal by name Dmitry Malyshev, who murdered several people and ate the heart of one of them, and the maniac Alexander Maslennikov, who killed and dismembered 2 women. It seems that these particular skills are currently in high demand in the Russian army. Therefore, instead of serving long prison sentences, both were recruited from their prison cells to the Russian army and sent to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians. As follows from Putin's speech on May the 9th, such people are real heroes of Russia. Upon returning to Russia, these heroes resumed their previous activities of violence. According to the Russian media, at least 24 convicted murderers who were pardoned and returned to Russia after participating in the war committed murders again. The actual number of crimes committed by the ex-convicts is likely much higher. It is hard even to imagine how residents in the occupied areas of Ukraine suffer as rapists and murderers serving in the Russian army enjoy full impunity for crimes against them. Reports from the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights starkly outline the extensive and systematic use of torture by Russian aggressors. This includes the use of sexual violence as a weapon against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, reaching a level of brutality and impunity that even shocks seasoned experts. And all the above is carried out by a country whose Orthodox Church leader openly advocates for war and even blesses weapons to kill Ukrainians. Mr. President, all the above crimes cannot be committed perpetually. It must be stopped. When faced with such a widespread and severe war of aggression, a global effort is necessary. Therefore, on the 15th and 16th of June, the first summit on peace in Ukraine will take place in Switzerland. We have invited all peace-loving nations, and each nation can really bring peace closer. The summit will build on the discussion on Ukraine's peace formula and other various visions of the peace process. The summit will be a first step of a high-level political start towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the UN Charter and key principles of international law. As we are approaching this summit, Russia, however, intensifies its spreading of lies about a so-called peace deal that Ukraine and Russia were allegedly close to in spring 2022. Indeed, the delegations met, but the positions were so far away and Russia's demands were so bizarre that the prospect of a real solution was not even remotely in sight. It is clear why Russia focuses the public on the Istanbul talks in March 2022. It tries to shift the focus from what happened in February 2022. It is clear why Russia blames the Ukrainian president for undermining a deal that was never going to be reached in reality. It tries to make the way to real peace impossible. The name of the person who actually ruined the prospect of peace is Putin. He has been ruining peace in Ukraine for more than a decade. First, by occupying Crimea and parts of the Donbass in 2014, then by obstructing the Minsk and Normandy peace processes, then by launching full-scale war of aggression, and then by refusing to end it. This is why the war drags on. Only together can we stop Russia and put an end to its aggressive plans for the rest of Europe. For this to happen, keep supporting Ukraine and don't buy Russian lies. Therefore, it is really important, not only for Ukraine, that the majority of nations attend the summit. The more active the world is now in restoring a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine, the more likely it is that the others in the world will not become the victims of similar aggression. It is not brute force that should determine the world order, but the UN Charter. And in unity, we can force Russia to comply with it. The summit in Switzerland will particularly focus on energy and nuclear security, safety of navigation, and humanitarian issues, notably exchange of all for all and return of children who were forcibly deported to Russia. A stable, predictable peace, a stable, predictable, peaceful world is a world in which no one can spread violence and chaos, destabilization, and pain as Russia does now. There are no state borders or natural barriers that can stop the spread of radiation. There is no nation that would simply put up with the captivity or deportation of people by a hostile state. There is no nation that would accept that someone turned its cities into ruins. The peace formula must work for everyone, and it is a common interest of strategic nature for us all to show unity of purpose at the summit in Switzerland. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Germany. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. And I would also like to thank Director Lisa Doughton from OCHA and Ms. Caitlin Howarth for their valuable insights. Mr. President, Russia is relentlessly continuing its bombing campaign against Ukraine's critical infrastructure. By doing so, it is systematically destroying the livelihoods of the civilian population in blatant violation of international humanitarian law. In line with its imperial ambitions, Russia is trying to subjugate Ukraine, a sovereign and peaceful country. This is clearly incompatible with Russia's responsibilities as a permanent member of this Council. Russia is attacking the very foundation of the United Nations and of global peace and security. As a nuclear state, it is invading its neighbor that has renounced nuclear weapons, and by employing arms imported from Iran and the DPRK, it defies Security Council resolutions. To shield its illegal activities, it is dismantling the international arms control architecture and undermining instruments of this Council, such as the panel of experts for the DPRK Sanctions Committee. We, the international community, have to stand up for international law, for the UN Charter, and for humanity. We must protect Ukraine as well as this very organization from Russia's aggression. Germany supports Ukraine with political, humanitarian, and military means. Air defense systems supplied by Germany are actively helping to protect Ukrainian cities. We have also contributed in humanitarian relief efforts and as well as in reconstruction measures, including in energy infrastructure. Well, over 1 million Ukrainians have found refuge in Germany, mostly women and children. Germany continues its engagement in the search for a peaceful resolution in line with the UN Charter. The upcoming Peace Summit in Switzerland offers a unique platform in that regard. However, a just and lasting way out is only possible if Russia renounces its objective of conquest and annexation. Let me therefore conclude by again calling on Russia to immediately and unconditionally cease all its military operations, respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and to withdraw all its troops from Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for their statement. I give now the floor to the representative of Estonia. You have.
Mr. President, thank you for giving me the floor. I have honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We also align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. First of all, let me thank distinguished briefers for their most valuable input. Many thanks. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine keeps worsening. Every month, Russia uses over 130 types of missiles, including missiles provided by the DPRK, over 320 Shahed drones, and around 900 guided aerial bombs against Ukraine. As of late, we can also add chemical weapons to this list. These weapons are systematically used to kill and maim Ukrainian civilians, destroy homes, schools, hospitals, and places of cultural heritage, attack food storage facilities, and wipe out Ukrainian energy infrastructure on a daily basis. Russia's bombs have destroyed over 80% of Ukrainian thermal power plants and 50% of hydroelectric power plants, while it claims that it only targets military objects, including here in this room. Based on that, I can only conclude that either Russian soldiers have a disastrously poor aim rate, or that a permanent member of the Security Council is a pathological liar. More than 1,700 attacks affecting healthcare facilities and personnel, as verified by World Health Organization, and over 1,000 educational facilities damaged or destroyed, as recorded by Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights since 2022, and the pattern of double-tap attacks targeting civilians and the rescue workers helping them. These are the trademarks of Russia's aggression. We condemn Russia's constant and systematic violations of the UN Charter, international law, including international humanitarian law, the UN Security Council resolutions. We also recall the decision by the ICC to indict 2 Russian military commanders for alleged war crimes, which include deliberate attacking civilian targets and energy infrastructure in Ukraine. Mr. President, while the people of Ukraine continue to show remarkable resilience, we underline the need for sustaining humanitarian aid, including urgent support for the restoration of energy infrastructure. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have altogether contributed over $100 million worth of humanitarian aid to the people of Ukraine, and we will continue to support Ukraine until its victory. At the same time, we call upon all peace-loving member states to participate at the Peace Summit taking place in June in Switzerland, to contribute to comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on principles of the UN Charter and respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Let me use this opportunity to remind that 18th of May will mark the 80th anniversary of Crimean Tatars' mass deportations carried out by the totalitarian Soviet regime. The systemic forced deportations were a widely used colonial tactic led by Stalin to suppress dissent and enforce Russification, by the way also widely used in the Baltic countries. Mr. President, to conclude, the aging dictator who usurped the power in Russia by re-electing himself complained last week that Russia is going through a difficult period. I have a humble recommendation to ease Russia's heavy burden. The solution is simple and has been repeated uncountable times by many around this very table and around the globe, indeed. Withdraw your military forces immediately, completely and unconditionally from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. Lisa Doughton and Caitlin Howard have shown a stark light on the grave humanitarian consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Every discussion on Ukraine must start by stating one unequivocal fact. Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression constitute a manifest violation of international law, including the UN Charter and the resolutions of the General Assembly. As my German colleague stated very eloquently, on a daily basis, this is aggression not just against Ukraine, but against this organization right here as well. This is why, first, Russia must uphold international law and cease its attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure now. Second, Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for the war of aggression. A P5 member that tramples on the UN Charter has heightened responsibilities, not lower ones. And third, all nations, North and South, East and West, must come together in support of a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in Ukraine. President, these past weeks, Russia has continued its missile and drone attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, destroying a significant portion of Ukraine's energy generation capacity. Thousands over thousands of Ukrainians now lack access to electricity. Its missile attacks also continue in Odessa and other Black Sea ports, threatening the freedom of navigation and hindering grain and other deliveries to the global market. Russia continues, in other words, to weaponize food and deliberately undermines global food security. Such systematic airstrikes against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, in and of themselves, violate international humanitarian law and must stop immediately and unconditionally. Indeed, there are credible reports of Russia using double-tap strikes, where the second attack hits rescue workers. Russia's indiscriminate attacks further exacerbate the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine, with over 14 million people in need of assistance. You've heard so much about this here today. In response, the European Union and its member states have stepped up the provision of humanitarian and civil protection assistance, including, of course, power generators and power transformers. But Russia has an obligation to allow humanitarian aid to reach all those in need by enabling full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access through the front lines, and to stop withholding aid from people in need in the areas it has temporarily occupied. We recall the legally binding order of the International Court of Justice of March 22 for Russia to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine, legally binding. Third parties must immediately cease providing material support to Russia's war of aggression or other kind of cuddling. Secondly, Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression and for other most serious crimes under international law, as well as for the massive damage they have caused. The EU is firmly committed to ensuring full accountability for all crimes committed, including victims' rights to justice and reparation, as well as guarantees of non-repetition. We are working with all relevant multilateral and regional actors to achieve this. There can be no impunity for these crimes. Third, we reiterate our support for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. To this end, the aggressor must immediately, completely, unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine, and it must respect Ukraine's sovereignty and integrity in line with the resolutions of the General Assembly. We welcome Switzerland's initiative to host a summit on peace in Ukraine next month and call on all states to participate. The international community must reaffirm the centrality of international law, including the UN Charter and its principles. In closing, Mr. President, I reaffirm the European Union's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The EU will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. As for Russia, stop your systematic and brutal bombing of Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure right now. Stop your illegal war and the illegal and inhumane means that you are using to pursue it. Enough is enough. Thank you.
I thank the head of the delegation of the European Union for that statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland. You have the floor,
Mr. President, Excellencies, we thank Mozambique for organizing this timely meeting and Madam Briefers for their insightful interventions. Russia's war continues to tragically affect hundreds of thousands of civilians across the Ukraine on a daily basis. Being aware of how steep a price the Russian military is paying in human lives for any gains on the front lines, Moscow is bent on taking vengeance on the civilian population of Ukraine as a sort of punishment. Acting this way, Russia tries to degrade Ukrainian economy and society, making large parts of Ukraine uninhabitable, also by extensive mining operations. Speaking about the humanitarian aspect of this war of aggression, we must not only concentrate on the front lines alone, but also keep in mind the Ukrainian territory under temporary Russian control, including the illegally annexed Crimea, where innocent civilians continue to be subjected to the unimaginable abuse and denied even the most basic rights and freedoms. The purpose of those barbaric actions is clear: to destroy the lives of Ukrainian people, intimidate Ukraine and those who support it. In this context, we are particularly appalled by the ongoing deportations and transfers of Ukrainian children and their forced Russification. Mr. President, as we heard, the current wave of attacks by Russia against civilians is particularly brutal. Indiscriminate strikes, like the very recent ones on the schools in Nikopol and Kharkiv, resulted in serious damages and power shutdowns, aggravating the already existing humanitarian crisis by limiting the local population's access to healthcare, education, clean water, and food. Those attacks bear only significant negative environmental risks, including the risk of a nuclear incident that repeatedly raises concerns of the AIA experts. Poland is extensively cooperating with Ukraine in the field of energy security. At the same time, Mr. President, by focusing on its aggressive military campaign against Ukraine, Russia is continuing to curtail the basic rights and freedoms of its own population. The cause of the war keeps trickling down the ordinary Russian citizen, whose needs are being neglected and the government's unrelenting pursuit of its illusory war objectives. The bill of the war will be repaid for a long time by the future Russian generations. Mr. President, the international community must stand with Ukraine and do everything to make Russia stop its aggression. We welcome Switzerland's initiative to host a summit on peace for Ukraine in June. We are convinced that it should be the demonstration of the broadest possible commitment to the principles of sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Poland supports President Zelensky's peace formula as a plan for just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in Ukraine, and for ensuring that enduring security on the European continent. Ukraine fell victim of the Russian aggression, and it is Ukraine only who should be listened to as to the ways of any further peace agreements. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. We thank the Presidency of Mozambique for the opportunity to address the Council and the briefers for sharing their valuable updates. In recent months, Ukraine has endured some of the worst attacks since the start of Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression 2 years ago. Every single day, the devastating consequences are felt by civilians around the country. More than 10,800 civilians have lost their lives, the actual numbers likely higher, and many more have been injured, including a growing number of children. Russia's systematic and detrimental attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure are heinous and illegal, as they target civilian objects and objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Since 22nd March, there have been 5 massive attacks damaging over 80% of Ukraine's non-nuclear power plants. This has included dangerous attacks on hydroelectric infrastructure with added risk of environmental disasters in case of dam breaches. The attacks have disrupted the access to electricity and water for millions of Ukrainians, particularly in Kharkiv, where Russia is carrying out a dreadful campaign of daily attacks. As a consequence, Ukraine has been forced to impose restrictions on power consumption in several regions around the country. Unless Russia immediately halts its attacks and the energy infrastructure is quickly restored, there will be grave consequences for the civilian population during the coming summer, and even worse in the winter ahead. We reiterate that attacks against civilians and civilian objects are strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law and must stop immediately. President, we urgently call for full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to all areas in Ukraine, including those temporarily occupied by Russia. Humanitarian relief must be allowed to reach all civilians in need. We are also appalled by the continued reports of attacks on humanitarian workers and aid storage facilities. Just a few weeks ago, an airstrike caused considerable damage to the offices of the Danish Refugee Council in Kharkiv, forcing a temporary suspension of operations. We stress once again that humanitarian actors and their life-saving operations must be protected at all times. In closing, the Nordic countries continue to stand with Ukraine and its people, who have shown exceptional bravery and resilience in defending their freedom and our shared values. We continue to support efforts to ensure full accountability for international crimes committed in and against Ukraine. We echo the repeated calls for Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and withdraw its troops for the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We also extend our full support to the first summit on peace in Ukraine in Switzerland next month and hope that many countries will join. The Russian aggression and its detrimental global consequences demand united efforts, firmly based on international law, including the UN Charter, and in line with Ukraine's peace formula. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.